All right, guys, welcome to section 11.2. Today we're going to talk about the modern U.S. prison system and kind of where we're sitting at today and how the prison system works in the 21st century. So, first off, the United States is a huge outlier when it comes to countries and their prison system. Okay, we have 5% roughly of the world's people. Okay, roughly 5% of all the people in the world live in the United States. And yet we have roughly 25% of the world's prisoners. So we are incarcerating people at a rate far above the world average. And last I checked, we were first in the first world and maybe even first in the entire world. But we have an incarceration rate of 655 out of every 100,000. Okay? So for any given randomly selected 100,000 people in the United States, 655 of them are going to be in prison. Now, to give you an idea, in the United Kingdom, that number is 140 per 100,000, so roughly a fifth of ours. In Germany, it's 75, and in Japan, it's 41 per 100,000. So that's less than 10% of our incarceration rate. Okay, so this is controlling for amount of population. This is not just because we have a larger population. This is controlling for that. This is the incarceration rate. We are incredibly more likely to incarcerate our citizens than any other first world nation on the planet. Okay, now of those 655 out of every 100,000, roughly 20% of them are there for some kind of drug offense. Right? Whether it's using drugs, selling drugs, importing drugs, some kind of drug offense. Okay? In the 60s, 70s, 80s, up till today, we've had this thing called the war on drugs. And this war on drugs has caused our prison population to absolutely skyrocket. Just in the last few years, the prison population has started to level off and even tick down just a little bit. In just the last few years, it's gone down just a little bit, and hopefully that trend continues. But because this is incredibly expensive, the cost to house those inmates it costs the taxpayer a lot of money. Why does it cost so much? Well, one of the things that causes increased costs of the system is a focus on rehabilitation. Okay, so way back in the first few sections, I talked to you about Lombroso. His theories held sway for a long time throughout the 20th century, and his theories basically said that people are criminal. If they're criminal, they're always going to be criminal. There's nothing you can do about it, right? So as his theories became more and more obviously bunk, we started moving towards rehabilitation, right? Because if Lombroso's wrong, that means people can change. People can become more law-abiding. People can become less criminal over time. Thus, we need to do what we can as a society and as a criminal justice system to try to make sure that happens. So we're moving towards rehabilitation, which increases short-term costs, right? So the upfront cost can be much higher. But if it works, if it's an effective measure or effective method of rehabilitation, it decreases long-term costs because you're reducing the number of people who are going to come back, right? So we might pay a bunch of money to make sure that prisoners get a GED or an associate's degree or a welding certificate or whatever. But if that can prevent people from coming back to prison, if it can lower our recidivism rate by any kind of significant amount, that might save us a whole lot of money in the long term. But unfortunately, this being the 21st century and the United States, politicians do not care about the long term. Okay? All they care about is the next quarter, the next year, the next congressional term. They do not care about the long term. So they are now going back to cutting this rehabilitation and saving money in the short term, but ultimately really costing us money in the long term. Another thing has been a drop in prisoner income generation, right? So when I talk to you about those old systems, the old systems were a lot of times self-sufficient, right? Because they would make something and then sell it, and that income, whether it was food or manufactured goods or whatever, that income would go to pay for the prison. Now, anybody seen that movie, The Shawshank Redemption? If you haven't seen that movie, pause this right now, go find it. I don't know if it's on Netflix or Amazon Prime or whatever, but find it somewhere. Watch that movie. It is brilliant. It's one of the greatest movies ever made, and it's about the prison system. But there's one scene in particular, and I'm not giving any too big of spoilers here, so if you haven't seen it, you can still listen to this. But there's one scene in particular where this warden of this prison, called Shawshank, is renting out his prisoners as labor in the local area to do different things, right? So anybody needs labor, people, they come to the prison, the warden rents out the prisoners. And there's a scene where this warden is talking to a local businessman, and the businessman says, look, you can't bid on this upcoming project. If I don't get that contract, my business is going under. I'm going to be out of a job. My business is going to be dissolved. Please, please, please do not bid on this upcoming contract. And the warden says, well, now I don't know if I could do that. Like, you know, this and that, and I need to make sure these boys get plenty of work and blah, blah, blah. So the businessman who's there says, I tell you what, my wife made you this delicious pie, and hands him a box, right? And the warden opens the box, and there's a pie and an envelope with a big stack of cash. And the warden says, you know what? I think my boys are busy that week. I'm not going to be able to bid on that job after all. And that kind of illustrates two reasons why this prisoner income generation thing has gone down. First, it provides really gigantic, widespread opportunities for crime and fraud and kickbacks and bribery and all those things that we really don't want in our criminal justice system. But second, it really destroys the legitimate businesses that the prisoners are kind of can undercut, right? Because I don't care what kind of business you're in, if you're using prison labor, you can undercut the prices of anybody doing that same business without using prison labor, right? So whether it's, you know, felling trees or manufacturing goods or farming or whatever, you can always sell those products or services for way less money if you're using prison labor compared to if you have to pay your workers. So it was knocking out legitimate businesses. So today, basically, when prisoners work, when prisoners have some kind of job, the only way they're allowed to produce anything, whether it's a product or a service, is when it's for the prison itself, for government consumption, or in an area in which there is no legitimate business already in place in the United States, right? So prisoners can make license plates, which is kind of the classic example. Excuse me. But because making license plates is for the government, right? It's doing things that there is no legitimate business to do. In Texas, a lot of prisoners will make furniture for the U.S. or the Texas state government offices and stuff, right? So if you go into Texas state government offices, a lot of that furniture that was made there was made by prisoners. And then if there's like a complete lack of any American business in that area, so like garment making, right? So we have lots of like clothing designers and clothing stuff in the United States, but there's almost zero clothing manufacturing in the United States. So prisoners can do those kinds of things. But it's very, very limited, and it's very easy for outside businesses to come in and say, hey, stop doing that. You're ruining my business. And then the prisoners are not allowed to do that anymore. There's also been an increase in the prisoner rights movement, right? So just because they're in prison, just because they've convicted of a crime, does not make them any less human. and they have a constitutional right to be free of cruel and unusual punishment. And that means that they have to have decent exercise facilities. That means they have to have decent food. That means they have to have decent libraries. It means they have to have access to phones to call their lawyers. It means they have to have access to lots of different things. And those rights, it's great that prisoners are earning these things because they are human beings and they do deserve some basic rights, but they cost money. And so those are driving up costs. And then that last thing on there is basically just showing that the cost has increased because the scale of the problem has increased, right? So in 1923, the entire country had 61 prisons. Entire country. So today we have 1,700 plus state prisons, over 100 federal prisons, and 942 juvenile facilities. And this doesn't include things like jails and specialty prisons and all these other things that aren't counted in those numbers. So this is not a complete list. 1,700 just state prisons. Okay, all of those facilities are incredibly expensive, and that is why costs have risen so much and why they continue to rise. Okay, so there is a difference between a jail and a prison. All right. A lot of people use those terms interchangeably. They are not interchangeable. Jails are not prisons, and prisons are not jails. They are two wildly different things. Jails are usually, though not always, attached to a law enforcement group or a city or a county or if you get arrested in the New York City by the New York City Police Department, you will go to the New York City jail. If you get arrested by the Johnson County Sheriff's Office, you will go to the Johnson County Jail, right? And a lot of times the same organization that runs the policing part will run the jail part. People in jails are there because they've just been arrested. They are there pre-sentence, right? So they're there during their, if they, no matter what they've been arrested for, you get put in a jail. Now, if you can make bail, you can get out of jail. But if you can't make bail, you sit in jail. And you sit there until you get convicted or sentenced, right? So let's say I get arrested, I go to jail. I get out on bail. I get now convicted of that crime. I go to trial. I get convicted. I come back to jail and await my sentence. Okay? Or I get arrested. I go to jail. I can't afford bail. I sit there and wait until my sentence. Right? Or until I get found not guilty. Then I get out of jail. Or if you are convicted of a misdemeanor crime, and again, in 49 out of 50 states, a misdemeanor crime has a punishment of less than 1 year. So the people that have been sentenced, they've been found guilty and they've been sentenced to a misdemeanor offense. You get sentenced to a month in jail or 6 months or 11 months or whatever. You serve your time in those jails along with everybody else. So everybody's grouped together, right? No matter whether you've just been arrested, whether you're waiting on your sentence, or whether you've been sentenced to 6 months and now you're just serving out that time, you serve, everybody is kind of in that same facility, okay? Whereas prisons are there for people who have been convicted of felonies, which again, in 49 out of 50 states means you're serving more than 1 year. In Texas, it means you're serving more than 2, okay? So the minimum sentence to be put in a prison is 1 year. And everybody there has already been convicted. A jury has found them guilty, or they have pled guilty to some felony offense. And they are segregated. Okay? You're segregated based on lots of different things. Obviously, you're segregated based on gender. Even jails are segregated based on gender. But prisons are segregated not just based on gender, but on security status. So there's minimum, medium, maximum, and supermax. and each one has different kind of rules, and different people go to these different prisons based on how violent they are, whether they're gang members, things like that. But they can also be segregated based on things like what you were convicted of, right? So child molesters and other sex offenders are usually abused by the other inmates in many prisons. So a lot of prisons will keep the people who have been convicted of sexual assaults physically separate from all the other prisoners. Okay, so they have their own little area, their own building, their own yard, all that kind of stuff. And so they also might have a segregated section just for gang members, right? They don't want gang members recruiting from the rest of the general population, so they segregate them off in a special area. Okay, makes sense. Prisoners are not all put in the same place. All right. So how do they determine where you should go? Well, when you're first sentenced, let's say I'm sentenced to a felony, I'm convicted of a felony, and I'm sentenced to 10 years in prison. Well, my first stop is I go to the prison system's classification area. Okay, in this, and then I'll have anywhere from a couple weeks to a couple months of being in this special area. During that time, they kind of teach me. It's kind of an introduction to prison, right? So here's your uniform. Here's how you make your bed every morning. Here's what you call the guards. Here's how the cafeteria works. All those things you kind of get, being a prisoner 101 training, if you will. During that time, they kind of figure out what facility you're going to go to and what security level you're going to be in, right? So do you deserve minimum security prison? Do you deserve maximum security prison? Are you violent? Have you been in prison before? Are you a member of a gang? Do you get along well with the other prisoners and the guards and stuff? They determine all these things, and they also determine your living environment, right? So sometimes, the worst of the worst, you're going to be put in solitary confinement. Kind of the lowest level is where they put you in kind of a dorm style area where there's kind of one big room, and there'll be 40 or 50 inmates all sleeping in this one giant room with kind of bunk beds and their own little lockers and stuff. If you ever watched Orange is the New Black, another great show, highly recommended. It's on Netflix. It's about a woman who goes to prison, and she lives in this big area where it's a giant room with a whole bunch of women all kind of in this co-living area. But that's kind of the minimum thing. And then the medium one is, of course, in a normal cell, either with a cellmate or by yourself. But it kind of who you are, what you've done, your criminal history, all these things kind of play into where you're going to be based on all those factors. Okay. Special populations, groups that get special treatment, special focus, special these things can cause you to get different treatment. Very importantly, mental stability, right? So if you are not mentally stable, they don't want to put you in with everybody else. If you have some kind of mental issue, even if you weren't found insane at trial, if you have some mental issue, they might want to segregate you away, put you in a special area of the prison, make sure you're getting extra attention, extra medication. The guards and staff are trained specially to deal with you, things like that. Age. Obviously, if you are under the age of 18, you're convicted of a juvenile offense, you're going to go to a juvenile facility. If you're over the age of 18, you're going to go into an adult facility. But even within adult facilities, sometimes they have special areas for the, kind of 18 to 21 or 18 to 23 kind of, very young crowd. Because they don't want those very young people to be abused or taken advantage of by the older prisoners, because they are kind of young and naive and aren't really ready for the realities of prison, if that makes sense. Gang affiliation, if you're affiliated with the Bloods or the Crips or the Aryan Brotherhood or the Latin Kings or the whatever, you might get a special area or a special assignment for your facility. And then, of course, women. We never, ever, ever house women with men. Sometimes they will be at the same facility, but they will be in completely separate sections of the facility that are physically separate, right? So, one giant prison might have a men's prison in this, special geographic area, and then down here is the women's prison, and never, prisoners from one never visit the other. Even though they're on the same grounds with interchangeable staff and things like that, they are physically separate. Then even within women's prisons, they have special areas for pregnant women and nursing mothers because they need extra medical attention. They might need extra, kind of parenting classes, extra help dealing with either their fetus or their baby. There are some prisons are developing these areas, and they're allowing children to stay with the mother for longer and longer because so much research has shown that it's very important to a child's development to stay with the mother as long as possible and to form that bond with the mother. So prisons are kind of letting mothers keep their children with them in special segregated areas of the prison for longer and longer and longer. But anyway, that's prisons today. We will be back with section 11.3.